Once a proper barrage comes down upon them all, the trenches, concrete observation posts and barbed wire will go up to heaven in a column of dust or a cloud of sand. The sailors are convinced that their position is impregnable. They have certainly worked quite hard at it and could not have done better. But since the autumn of 1914, when they lost the important sluice gates of the Yser at Newport, they have learnt nothing about the war as it has been waged on the Somme and the Ain, at Arras and Wytschaete. Near the northern extremity of the front, there sits an NCO behind a wall of sandbags only a few feet away from the waves. Here the enemy's position is only 17 metres away from our own. When once one has had the curiosity to put one's head up cautiously under its steel helmet in order to enjoy the thrill, one pops it down again quick enough. There one can see with the naked eye the little mirror of the sniper with the telescopic sights. The whole position can be surveyed through a stereoscopic telescope from a raised position known as the puma. The wolf, the hyena and the polecat are progressively smaller creatures which are sighted in front of the puma. From there one can see how weak it all is. One cannot feel much confidence either in the coast fortifications and batteries. I take it that English men of war could give them a good shelling without running much risk. They tried it recently, and masked themselves for the purpose in a cloud of artificial white mist, which lay all round the fighting ships and made it quite impossible to aim from our side. However diligently one bombards a cloud of mist, there is plenty of room in it in which to miss. At the end of the barbed wire entanglements, half out of the water, lie several dead cattle, shapeless and stinking victims of the U-boats. June 25th, 1917. The Army Remount Depot is in the square at Ghent and partly in the buildings of the 1913 exhibition. I can no longer allow myself to send parties there to fetch horses. They let the most hopeless, useless and abominable stuff be foisted upon them. Consequently, I have to go myself, but the quest is not very encouraging. What things they do call horses nowadays. It is the same everywhere, one must admit. Consider what is now passed off as leather, boots and cloth. If it is the same with the guns, they cannot be much good. July 3rd, 1917. Today only a pound of grain per head was issued for the horses, and the field post people report that the troops are asking to have bread sent them from home. Granted that the human being pays too much attention to his inside when he is thinking of saving his body, and too little when it is a question of his soul. All the same, it is appalling that within half a year after the defeat of Russia, there should not be enough corn available. Human labour is no more good. Only the earth still does its duty in places. You should see this country. Fields of corn so high that one could almost drown in them. They bend and give at the knees under the weight of ears larger than I have ever seen before. The oats stand breast high. The wheat is as close and thick as a golden fleece, and in these parts, when they cut the clover, they stand it up in sheaves. July 8th, 1917. In our northern corner there is every sign of a colossal action on both sides. Our reconnoitring airmen come up against a tremendous enemy barrage, against which 5 of our machines smashed themselves up almost simultaneously on the same spot. Richthofen has been badly wounded. Canvas camps of 200 or more big tents appear overnight like mushrooms. There are whole towns of new hutments. Munition dumps are being established close up to the front. Busy movements of infantry, unrest everywhere. That is what we see on the enemy's side. On our own we are closing up. The troops are equipped for special duties and trained as for a stage play. Of course, the reality is always different from what one thinks. But what is one to do? Neither officers nor men can do without a rehearsal. Brilliant improvisations are no good. When forces on both sides are strained like this, the individual feels the strain too. It becomes too much, but nowadays one is not simply thrown straight into a red-hot furnace as used to be the case. One lines up, so to speak, for the business, and this experience is slightly less unpleasant than the other. July 11th, 1927. Another move yesterday, the 17th in the last 10 months, according to the Judge Advocate, who pays no attention to events unless they can be considered statistically. We are nearer than ever to the sea, and packed as tight as can be, men, horses, wagons and guns, all on top of one another. The Marine Brigade is being withdrawn and army troops taking its place everywhere. In the English lines, the transport trains follow one upon another. The front-line trenches are already packed with stormtroops. Yesterday evening our divisions captured the salient which they were defending on this side of the Yser estuary by a surprise attack with 140 batteries, a beach picnic, as it was called in orders. An artillery operation on a tiny area. Bang. All went well because it was well prepared. It has taken us long enough to learn that it does not do simply to order an attack for the next day, but that everything must be reconnoitred and prepared beforehand. July 13th, 1917. It is always more or less wearisome to wait in an anteroom, even when it is that of the theatre of war. In every case one settles oneself 25 times or more, puts oneself straight, and feels about to see that everything is handy, but one is perfectly clear that it is a wearisome business. It does not help to know that the sparrows in the street, the starlings in the poplar trees, and our agents in Switzerland are all singing the same song about the great British offensive on land and sea. They even know the day more or less exactly, as well as how many of the new type of monitor, how many aeroplanes, and what divisions are to take part in it. But all that is not amusing, because a man necessarily finds the most beautiful curtain less interesting than the worst play. In such a case, the only thing to do is to stick it. That is all there is to be said. Meanwhile, the half-year has once again gone by. Nature does not spare herself. There is not a tree or an animal which takes precautions for the future. Everything that lives, lives for the day, and does not worry about its end. This prodigality is overwhelming. The roses flower just as passionately as if their one purpose in life were to bloom and fall. The fruits ripen on the tree as if they set store on breaking off from the sap of life and falling to the ground as soon as they possibly could. The corn sinks under the weight of its own ears, which it developed too quickly. They won't wait for anything. 2. July 18th, 1917. Your last few lines from your Berlin address say that that city seems to you to be inwardly decayed, but you don't write a word about it, not even about the people who live there and whose life we used to share. I grant you that it seemed absolutely revolting during these last few days, to judge by its public life. Even nervousness can become a scandal, and that in Berlin certainly was so. In addition, there was self-seeking of the most disgusting and callous sort, bestial fear of losing business and profits, of so-called popular sentiment and of imaginary impossibilities. The Berlin newspapers behaved as no similar foreign newspaper would behave. We could compare their tone, for we get a plentiful supply of foreign papers. In speaking of the events in Berlin, I do not include the change of the Chancellor. Bethmann Hollweg commanded no confidence whatever abroad, so he had become an impossibility. But does his successor command it? Bismarck was well known in St. Petersburg, London and Paris, long before he became a Prussian minister. Michaelis is entirely unknown. Consequently, he is just as badly placed and will be just as much mistrusted as his predecessor. Have political parties and majorities in the whole course of human history ever done the right thing when it came to making changes? They will not succeed in producing either one sort of peace or the others. There is no advantage in a formula. They ought to have found a man capable of making peace. He would then have found his own formula, according to his capacity. They ought to have said how peace was to be made. Then everybody would have been grateful. As it is, we are just where we were, and I should not be surprised if these people in their helplessness also come back to peace at any price, as their formula, as soon as they see that peace by agreement does not draw. One shuts one's eyes because there is nothing but pettiness to look at. Perhaps it is just as well that one can shut them because it becomes intolerable to look on. Perhaps there lies hope in the very fact that the situation seems hopeless. July 22nd, 1917. A captured English sergeant reports that his countrymen expect to be in Ostend in 4 weeks. Apart from busy preparations on the part of the enemy, that is all that we know. It is possible that the business will start in a day or two. If our troops knew how much ammunition was piled up yonder, waiting to be used on their bodies, the very idea would probably get on their nerves. It is beginning to feel uncanny. As far as our divisional front is concerned, our successful beach picnic as the coup de main on the Yser Canal is called, has thoroughly upset the English. They keep up an unpleasant bombardment which leaves us no rest day or night. They raid our posts. They open sluices and flood the sectors nearest to them. Their cruisers and torpedo boats tear in and out of Dunkirk harbour, and their aeroplanes pelt us with bombs. Altogether, they're behaving like maniacs on the ground, in the water and in the air. But all that doesn't make us any wiser. In spite of all this, one can lie down on the beach of Ostend and look over the sea to a horizon undisturbed by any smoke or masts, but one feels the atmosphere charged all round about. I cannot say that we ourselves show up very well in all this. The troops at least express their feelings when they grouse. We, on the other hand, are polite enough to talk about duty, which is what we substitute nowadays for the beautiful idea of keenness and enthusiasm, just as turnip mush has to do instead of raspberry jelly, and wedlock instead of love. Is it true that one can only do things properly for love? It would be more honourable to say so. July 25th, 1917. So far as we can see, the great battle began last night somewhere to the south. Whether our division takes part in it will depend upon whether the enemy succeeds in the centre, that is to say, in the direction of rulers. His hopes of reaching Ostend, of which I have already written, lead one to suppose that the offensive will affect us. Moreover, the English, in addition to all previously known tortures, have been plaguing us recently with a terrible new device, namely gas bombardments. Even a small quantity, the slightest breath in fact, is sufficient to kill a man, not straight away but by degrees, sometimes after several hours. Respiration becomes more and more difficult as the lungs fill with liquid instead of with air, and they are eventually drowned, so to speak. It is horrible to watch people who have apparently escaped death succumbing to this gradual suffocation. This form of intensified torture does not only tell on the front line. Instead of the higher command keeping their heads all the clearer, their feverish nervousness increases by fantastic degrees. You might almost think it was the madness of Ajax, for it attacks the most responsible. The stream of useless reports, questions, and orders which pours in upon us from above can only be the result of disordered brains. Of course, the troops notice it. The subordinate staffs are tired and depressed, and the whole division is worn out from the rear before it has begun to be attacked by the enemy in front. July 27th, 1917. However many new guns we send up, and we do so every night, however many we repair, and we repair them night and day, we cannot keep up to the number which we ought to have. So it is all along the front just now. When once the enemy artillery observer who is directing the fire of his battery has found his mark, there is nothing for our gun to do except wait until it has been smashed up. The observing airman flies quietly about over his victim, protected by the barrage which the enemy air force has set up in the air. He reports by wireless without ceasing. Short, 100 yards right, OK. And even if the battery has time to cover itself up with a smoke screen, the guns stand little chance of escaping. The heavy ones are built in and cannot be removed to fresh positions. None of them can protect itself, for at the second direct hit the gun's crew quite rightly retires into the dugouts in order not to make a useless bullseye for the English. Moreover, everything is so close together that more often than not there is no room to change position, and when the damaged guns have been brought out through a ceaseless barrage fire under cover of night or smoke, the drivers are not particularly keen to go out on the following night to the bombarded position to put the new gun in its place. There's a double difficulty. The reserve guns have first to be brought up to the limber positions, and then the horses, drivers and guns crews have to be given a chance of getting the piece into the line. How is one to get teams enough? Where is one to borrow them? The tracks are all messed up, the horses collapse, the drivers can do no more because they're exhausted, and the gun gets stuck halfway. Perhaps it gets up the next night, perhaps not. On the way to Newport, I passed a shell hole, right in the middle of the road, at the bottom of which lay a horse. On the top of that lay a field kitchen, upside down, and over the lot a ration cart. They had all been pitched into the hole when the shell burst, the nervous horses presumably on top of the rest. God knows when it will all get cleared away, the hole filled and the road made passable. No work can be done except at night, and the nights are short. All the same, the English offensive is evidently held in check so far on the whole of the Fourth Army front. They have been wanting to let drive for some time, but our artillery is not groggy enough yet. For days the enemy's frontline trenches have been packed with troops. Our own form a loose belt in front of the main forces of our defence. Our men have now been suffering heavy losses every day, and one cannot count on their holding out longer than August 10th without a relief. Then we may get some rest again. It is always the same tale of massacre. July 29th, 1917. I am scared. For the first time in this war, I have doubts whether we shall be able to hold out against the odds. 30 new 4-gun batteries have appeared on the enemy's front in a single day, not counting those which may not have been spotted. On the Fourth Army front alone, there are 160 of those monsters which belch the most enormous shells at us from 25 miles away, that is to say, practically out of M range, and that is nothing compared with the total. Altogether, there must be 8,000 to 10,000 guns employed on this little bit of front. If one reckons that the main offensive is being made on a front of 25 miles, that means a gun to every 4 yards. Imagine all the 10,000 muzzles hurling out not only projectiles of iron and lead, but spreading poison gases as well. Imagine only a fifth of this number of guns opposed to this concentration, all overworked pieces which fire, it is true, but not so accurately as on the first day. Imagine an enemy airman cruising over each one of our batteries and directing onto it 5 times the fire which they can thunder, whereas they are perhaps unsupported by any air forces and simply have to sit tight. That is the picture which scares me. Verdun, the Somme and Arras are mere purgatories compared with this concentrated hell, which one of these days will be stoked up to white heat. The consequence is that, owing to nervousness or overweariness, or the feel of not being sufficiently strong, we man our forward positions and dugouts too closely and too soon. That means heavy sacrifices every day, before the battle has really begun, so to speak, for the infantry is already bearing the brunt of the casualties. In particular, the officers at battalion headquarters get caught. The English are aiming at depriving the troops of their leaders, for their airmen have every path and entry photographed. They see the runners disappear into the dugouts, and a few minutes later down come the shells there, just like a note when you strike the tuning fork. I was watching it yesterday. It makes you grind your teeth with rage and gives you a dry feeling in your throat. I know that I am no pessimist, but I have a sense for coming disaster. August 1st, 1917. The units are complaining. Their losses are heavy. They are complaining that they are too heavy to enable them to hold the position when the infantry attack, which we are still waiting for, begins. All the same, they are not quite right, as I have to prove to them, but regiment and battalion commanders lose their nerve and get panicky when they are assailed from the rear with a paper barrage, while the enemy continually plumps heavy bits of iron on the top of the concrete shelters in which they can hardly turn round. The people up above have not enough imagination to picture to themselves what it is like to be plagued in such conditions with memoranda and reports, with trench maps on a scale of almost 1:2, and orders as long as your arm. They have to report on every movement which a rifleman makes in his sleep. For every shot which by chance gets fired at the English, they get rung up out of their little bit of sleep. For every Tommy whom they capture, they have to send in a sketch map, showing where it happened and reporting. Even if this isn't literally true, the reality is a good deal worse. August 2nd, 1917. One man after another goes west. Yesterday we were burying an officer of the 237th Reserve Infantry Regiment, who was under me when we first reconnoitred our way in Flanders, when another one came over and said to me, "Now I am the last of the old crowd." Incidentally, this funeral was the most horrible performance in which I have ever taken part. There were 69 to be buried, including 4 officers. Detachments from each of their regiments had assembled for the occasion in the new cemetery at Ostend, the most desolate suburban site in the whole world. There hadn't been time to dig out each man his full 6 feet of earth. 2 long trenches, a man's length broad and almost touching one another, had been opened up 3 feet deep in the right-hand corner, and at the bottom of these the graves had been cut to another 3 feet, barely a pace being left from one to the other. There they lay, one beside another, just like a bag of game after a day's shooting. Where the two trenches met stood the Protestant chaplain on a plank laid across them, and uttered offensive platitudes which conveyed nothing to those present beside the fact that burying 69 men together was a sad business, only to be properly appreciated if one represented to oneself really and fully the true inwardness of the number 69. And in order to convey this impression, he continually recalled to us the fact that there were 69 of them, adding by way of consolation that there were more waiting in the mortuary. As we left the place, we promised one another that if any one of us got killed, we would not allow any chaplain to speak over his grave. I suppose it was not fair to generalize, but we were too disgusted. When one sees such a minister of God as that, one comes to the conclusion that God Almighty intends Christianity to die gradually, like a plant in a pot. Otherwise he would not allow it to have such profits. But I grant you that those two graves were not a pleasant sight, and the minister of God couldn't do anything to help that. August 6th, 1917. Yesterday it seemed certain that the relief would take place on the 7th or 8th, but today the preliminary orders have not been confirmed. However, we can safely assume that it has only been postponed for 24 hours at the most. After that comes my leave. 2 Flanders, September 1st, 1917. It was impossible yesterday evening to write you the last farewell I had intended in the smoky and used-up atmosphere of the Cologne waiting room, in the middle of people, smells and piles of luggage. Although we left A punctually, our engine, underfed on bad coal, lost 2 hours on the way to Cologne. At Cologne, proud in the possession of a portion of pickled pork, I went into the Domhof and had it cooked to make up for the absence of meat on the dinner menu. "A good advertisement for us," said the manager. The price of the dinner was calculated as if I had ordered the pork there and had it delivered by the hotel with half a pound of caviar into the bargain. On the other hand, I was invited, in the absence even of a paper napkin, to wipe my mouth on the tablecloth. There was neither soap nor towel in the lavatory. The brass taps had been removed, and I suppose that there hadn't been any warm water in the pipes for ever so long. I arrived here at midday instead of in the morning, but my trunk apparently found even this time too short, for it is hung up somewhere on the way where I can't get at it. In such cases one used to assume that it would come on by the next train. Nowadays it makes one anxious, for even in these things one is at the mercy of the Almighty God of War. Here I find things just the same. The division is quartered in the neighbourhood, healing the wounds which were dealt it before my leave. My billet is uncomfortable, but somebody sings quietly about the house in a very pretty and thoroughly musical voice. I am afraid of catching sight of the somebody who owns the voice, for I expect her to be pretty and engaging, and probably she does not at all correspond to her voice. September 8th, 1917. Today the division has taken over its old sector, and as the distribution of the troops and staffs is practically the same as last time, it would all be a fairly simple business, provided people would stick to orders and exercise a little common sense. But here one meets with the same extraordinary symptoms as elsewhere. One unit deliberately makes trouble for another by taking down necessary electric fittings, removing furniture and cutting out windows, by stealing the latches off doors because there is a little brass on them, by breaking into greenhouses in order to get a bellyache on the last night through eating unripe fruit, by carrying off wagons, dogs and straw which do not belong to it, etc., etc. All these things are not only a nuisance for the newcomer, but make him so tired that he is thankful when he has got everything straight again without further damage. Flanders, September 10th, 1917. A new line has been opened up for me in addition to the other numerous activities which I have already been forced to describe and threatens to develop. This is lecturing to the troops. What is meant by that can be seen from a momentous army order of Ludendorff, of which I will set down a few extracts in this diary, in order to preserve them from the files that grave in which so much that is vital and so much that is trifling lie buried out of sight. The attention of commanding officers of larger units, runs the order of July 31st, is drawn to a memorandum to be issued forthwith on the organisation of lectures, with a view to maintaining the fighting spirit of the army. It goes on to remark that the moral at home is low, and that, granted the existing close ties of the army with the country, the army cannot long remain unaffected by it. At home, selfishness and a reckless passion for pleasure and profit flourish side by side with croaking, pessimism and revolution-mongering, which are liable to prejudice the outcome of the war. These phenomena are to be traced partly to real privations, such as shortage of food and fuel, money troubles, the length of the war, loss of relatives, etc., but are partly also the result of deliberate propaganda, unscrupulously carried on by certain elements with the object of using these difficulties to further their political ends, and of stirring up class hatred and discontent of all sorts. The nation is absorbed by humdrum preoccupations, and hardly understands either the greatness and seriousness of the occasion or the sufferings of the army and the fleet. It is distracted by profitless discussions instead of bearing the war and its staggering burdens in cheerful unity and in a spirit worthy of its fighting sons. The order goes on to picture the effects of this feeling in the country on the army, and proceeds. This must not be allowed to continue unchecked. It is for the army to make its fighting spirit felt and thus revive the confidence in victory which the situation entirely justifies. It must constantly foster and maintain affection for the Kaiser and the reigning princes and the strong German sentiment for the fatherland, and thus ensure that a fight is put up against all agitators, croakers and weaklings both at home and at the front, without at the same time overlooking the trials which the country has to bear. Commanding officers are earnestly requested to give their closest attention to this most vital question. It is emphasized that they have before them a task of far-reaching importance, which calls for perseverance as well as tact and circumspection. For this purpose, lecture officers are being appointed at Army and Divisional HQ. I have been selected for my division. I welcome this duty because it gives one insight. It is not easy for commanding officers to gauge the spirit of their troops. The higher ones are especially in the dark. The short question, "How are you getting on?" asked by a general on parade or at casual visits, is invariably answered with an "all right," which does not convey much. The duty is certainly important, particularly so today for anyone who means to win the war or who hopes to do so. But if rightly understood, it will mean a lot of time for the man who undertakes it, and not very hopeful prospects. He is in the weaker position, for with an army like ours, the influence of the home has all the pull. To get the better of it from the front is a task which really goes against all the laws of gravity and the circulation. All the opposing forces are so direct in their working. They speak with the intimate voice of a mother, a sister, or a sweetheart. Against these voices we are to raise ours. How pitiful it will sound. Ludendorff's memorandum reminds me of what I once wrote, that wars are won or lost by letters from home. Our sector of the front is fairly quiet. The prisoners that we take know nothing of any intention to attack. Every now and then the English bombard Ostend from land and sea, but that wretched old giraffe house, the Kursaal, remains intact. September 19th, 1917. Autumn is here. At first one cannot believe it, then all at once it reigns supreme, here as elsewhere. Suddenly one sees that the potato plants are no longer green, that the paths are all covered with leaves, and that the sun shines with an effort. If it were peacetime now, I should just be mapping out an autumn ride. September 27th, 1917. The clear moonlit nights, which just now follow the clear days, turn the swarms of enemy airmen into a plague and a danger. Every night they smash up some house or other with their bombs, and the cellar, which used to be the favourite refuge in the old days, is no use now, since the hits all show that one would certainly get buried under the ruins of the collapsed house. None of our own machines appears to protect us. Not even a few machine guns open fire, since there is none available hereabouts. Consequently, the enemy does not need to be very daring to come down within a few yards of the ground and cruise about until he is sure of his mark. It is impossible every now and then even to reach Ostend, because it gets bombarded alternately from land and sea, and it is not worthwhile risking the little horse and cart for the sake of a bathe, a sole, or a dozen crayfish, not to mention one's own person, although that matters less. The most evident result of the bombardment for the wartime bather from outside the town is that the bathing women are too scared to look after their bathing machines, and that there are no fish or crabs because the fishermen won't go out when the English monitors are patrolling the coast. Thereby Ostend loses its last attraction. The deserted promenade with the row of commonplace villas behind it is too depressing for words. I am particularly sad about the loss of all the beautiful positions at Langemarck and Pilkum, which my old division captured in April 1915, and which are associated with many little exploits of my men. All that is now in the hands of the English. The oil mill at Rulers is deserted. Sidoni, Febronier, and Demetria, who used to dispense gin at the corner, have been evacuated. My little old billet has been shot to pieces, and the enemy shells now reach right into Rulers. The battle in Flanders is not yet decided, the offensive not even stayed, but the newspapers all talk as if we had already won it. I've received the cakes. You might think that that's not so important, but it is. For the staff cook now revels in onions with every dish he serves. The result is that often long after dinner one wants something to dissipate them, but it's not easy to find anything that will settle an onion. I don't need any butter, for I have again trained myself to do without it. I collect my ration and send it to someone at home who is short of it. As a matter of fact, food supplies at home seem to be considerably improved. This is confirmed by men who have returned from leave in Wiesbaden and Frankfurt, and no gospel is so welcome as that news nowadays. West Flanders, October 5th, 1917. The lectures have already taken in sail somewhat, and at least changed their name. They are now known as Instruction in Duties to the Fatherland. The reason of this transformation are the attacks of the socialists. There is one thing which they don't realize. If one wants to win the war, and they still want to do that, the moral of the troops must be preserved by all reasonable means. These lectures, this Instruction in Duties to the Fatherland, as we give it, is perfectly reasonable. It speaks well for the far-sightedness of the Bavarian Army Command that it had already realized the need in March, long before anybody else had thought of it, and has had very good results in the Bavarian regiments. In course of the discussion on the subject, I proposed that a German citizen's handbook should be written for the army, in order that each man should know what he had to expect from the state, and my father was asked to write it. Unfortunately here, too, we proved to be short of material. There is no paper to be had for the purpose. That does not prevent the Dresdener Generalanzeiger treating the world to 32 pages of print, but for a citizen's handbook there is no paper to spare. We shall have to find it first. 2. October 9th, 1917. You may be right when you say that my letters have an autumnal sound weary, and without any real confidence. It is autumn, and the Flemish autumn, with its rainstorms over the monotonous landscape, is not the same as the warm-coloured, comforting autumn of the German mountains. It sweeps over devastated country. Weariness, too, is there, because I am bound to get weary at uncongenial work, which simply has to be done as a matter of routine in order not to get behindhand with it. If it were only those two things, it would not be so bad, for autumn and weariness pass away with the spring and fresh occupations. As to what you say about the absence of confidence, the prospect of the human race at the present time is such a deception that it makes one feel deceived in oneself. After all, one must take the world and the human race seriously, hence they serve to everyone as a sort of mirror, and when one looks into the mass and recognizes oneself among the many fleeting forms, one gets a temporary shock which makes one recoil and shrink into oneself. It is more or less the same with both of us, and it is better that we should be conscious of the fact than that we should gaze into the mirror with blind eyes, and possess the confidence of the blind who smile even when they have got 1 foot over the precipice. Moses himself could not alter the face of his people. The trouble with me is that I am not enough of an egoist to realize that it cannot be changed. Moses retired onto the mountaintop. I suppose that really the only genuine confidence is that which one has in oneself, the feeling that at worst one has the strength to save oneself out of the deluge onto a hilltop. Properly speaking, one is not entitled to that feeling until one has been through a tremendous struggle, but in spite of all, I do not think that I have lost it yet. October 14th, 1917. Last night, when I came into my quarters, queer thunderstorms were flashing and rolling in wild from the sea. It soon became icy cold, and all of a sudden, so pitch dark that I had to bring out my pocket lamp, whereupon the light was so brilliant that it gave me a shock. The autumn weather on the land was fighting with the last waves of warmth from the sea. It was as though the powers of land and sea were battling together, quite uncanny. For a long time I stood looking out into the night. The beasts of the apocalypse seemed to be at grips there, lashing at one another with hot and cold talons, with icy and glowing breath, with limbs of different shapes and sizes. Probably sea storms like this are nothing unusual at this time of year, but they are not often so vivid and impressive. Inwardly, I was more in the mood for rest and reflection, but these two monsters raged in front of me instead, and would not let my senses go. There is another thing which affects me too. Round Passchendaele they are fighting hard for farms and hedgerows, all of which I know intimately. It was from there that I wrote my first letters home from the front. I feel myself caught, so to speak, between this battle of the elements and that of men. I could not devote the quiet of the night to calm thoughts, and now one day after another brings me nothing but an eternal blight. Same date. Recently I had occasion to read some extracts from Tolstoy's diary. One of his remarks struck me as unusually shrewd. Organization, he writes in 1898, all organizations relieve man of every sort of duty, human, personal, or moral. Therein lies the root of all the evil in the world. Men are beaten to death, demoralized, degraded, and nobody bears the responsibility. My present employment is like a hydra. The more I do, the more demands rear up their hissing heads at me. The movement of officers has increased so extraordinarily that we can hardly make both ends meet in this respect. They nearly all go down on grounds of health. As soon as the bombardment begins to get hot, some appendicitis, or heart trouble, or sciatica begins to worry them, which is always dormant when there is no shooting on. West Flanders, October 18th, 1917. What is going to happen? According to the reports of reliable agents, the English fleet is waiting with full steam up. This can only mean an attack on the Flanders coast, but to my mind such a move could have no sense unless Haig actually breaks through at Rulers. Are the English so confident? I cannot believe in a breakthrough, for although the battle rages constantly in incomprehensible confusion round Poelcapelle and Passchendaele, there is nothing frightening about that. At such points in the main attack, all communications invariably break down. Every position is packed with troops, and those in front have no idea what is going on until they come to a standstill, not even the officers commanding. It is the same on both sides. The danger here lies in the ridiculous behaviour of many divisional staffs, which, in order to save their troops from being used up, think of nothing else than how soon they can get out of the hell. That entails withdrawals and reliefs, all of which mean waste of lives and material. The troops are being used up at a disquieting rate. Everybody is best pleased if his spell is over as soon as possible. General von Lossberg, however, who is in command of the defensive operations, has not got an unlimited supply of divisions. Not many people seem to realize that. For the last few days there has been nothing much doing on our divisional front except the usual artillery duel. We have been fighting the last summer flies, which attack one so unkindly, almost as much as the English. The moral of the men appears to be excellent, and is generally considered to be so. If every now and then some officer did not complain that he had still not got this or that decoration, and make a great fuss and pother over it, if every now and then some private did not grouse about the pea soup of his mess being burnt, one might imagine that everything was for the very best. But the very paltriness of these demands and complaints proves how little spirit and determination yet remains, not to speak of such a quality as dash. The good moral is very superficial, and is the consequence of slight losses, comfortable quarters, and the doubtful pleasures of Ostend and Bruges, where the troops can buy their bad beer and cigars, and enjoy paying heavily for them after the manner of the rich. In addition, they can listen to a bad gramophone, or one of those mechanical organs, such as one always finds in the street-corner taverns of England and Belgium. All the same, a man is doing his job here in defending his country. The same cannot be said of his elected representatives in the Reichstag. These gentry have never realized that it will have to fare much worse with Germany before she gives in, as if they had to stick it as we do. Surely it is for the soldiers at the front to decide. There seems to be no lesson or warning for them in the prospect which faced Frederick the Great after the Battle of Kollin, or in the condition to which Prussia was reduced after the Treaty of Tilsit. Everyone must admit that the behaviour of our Parliament does not inspire confidence. Parliamentary and undisciplined have become synonyms. Nobody seems to trouble any more about all this hooting, booing and interruption, all this scrapping and caterwauling. It is high time that the frogs were given a block of wood to rule over them. If one casts one's eyes from the front, where there is certainly not much enthusiasm these days, back homewards, they meet a very pitiful sight. Many men will ask themselves whether there is any sense in going back, and some will envy those who have no home to go to. The only consolation to be derived from the prospect lies in the thought that all the screaming in Parliament and between the parties is quite a superficial phenomenon, since all that is best, youngest and strongest in the country is at the front. After all, we are still better off than the Russians, with their mutinous fleet, a disintegrating army, and bandits systematically robbing the railway trains. They are in vain struggling to revive forces which no longer exist. Think of a man who felt the power in him to say to the dead, "Arise." He speaks the word and the dead do not arise. Even Christ himself could not have stood that. Varsenere, October 23, 1917. The division has been relieved. Presumably it is destined to be put in again at the warmest spot after a fairly brief rest, the usual trouble. I find myself now at exactly the same spot where I was in August of last year, just before I left the Western Front to go to Galicia. 2. West Flanders, October 25, 1917. For the time being, we are again having a heavy time without any support. Outside, the autumn storms are blowing the leaves from the trees once and for all, while inside we freeze in front of the Belgian fireplaces because no German understands them. He sets aside no wood to dry, and out of ignorance declares these agreeable companions for a winter evening to be entirely useless. We are quartered in the middle of a wonderfully laid-out park in a chateau of refined hideousness, perpetrated in 1877–80 by a German architect, as an inscription reveals to us. There are thousands of bottles of first-class wine in the cellars, still there, but the army in its wisdom has requisitioned them and distributes them to the troops, who would be just as happy with a stiff brandy or a glass of beer, whereas we are allowed to pay 5 marks in the canteens for a concoction of whortleberry juice. I do not grudge the troops their drink, but at the same time we have none. The beautiful greenhouses, which were full of lovely fruit, grapes and peaches last year, when I left the district, are now broken and empty, thanks to the efforts of various divisions which have been busy here. Now that the division is resting, the discussion about whether the night has been quiet or not, how many shells were fired at this or that battery, and where from, etc., has dried up, and there is nothing left to talk about. After dinner, a sociably inclined lieutenant of signals plays 1 or 2 pieces for violin and piano with the GSO. 2. The signaller scrapes away with vigour and empressement, while the GSO goes in for constant use of the pedals. The whole sounds rather like a bull in a china shop. His Excellency considers a certain Serenade for Kubelik particularly beautiful. The composer, as usual, counts for nothing. Thereby the rubbish has been officially licensed and is dispensed to us plentifully. Fortunately, a dog sometimes saves the situation by howling in the middle. Toasts are being drunk in Constantinople, while on the Ain lots of guns are being blown up and abandoned to the enemy. All that doesn't chime, and it is impossible not to feel that there is good reason for being uneasy. November 2nd, 1917. It still remains to be seen whether the enemy has given up his great scheme of landing troops on the coast simultaneously with a big offensive at Passchendaele, because he does not feel strong enough. For the time being, we are still expecting an attack, and Bruges and the surrounding country are stiff with troops. Spirits are fairly high. The men are so far still happy. From all the officers who give instruction in duties to the fatherland, I hear tales of the excellent moral of the troops. But a blind man is always cheerful. Nobody can possibly calculate what he or we have got to face. You have only got to consider what 3 years of war did for Russia. Even though the effects will not be quite the same with us, they are bound to tend in the same direction, namely of demoralization and disintegration. November 7th, 1917. In the next few days we are leaving this chateau, and for the immediate future shall have to get used to less comfortable quarters. We are going into the line to the south in front of Rulers, country which I know quite well. There are hardly any billets left there, and those which still survive will be stuck to by the troops which are already there. In many places, which in 1915 were used to quarter a single squadron, now regiments, staffs and details lie so thick that even the lice in the seams of your shirt are cramped for room. The gradual withdrawal from the Ypres salient has been delayed with real art, but it will still have to keep on being a retirement. The odds against us are too big. You can realize what it means to have 3 times as many guns and 5 times as much ammunition against us when I tell you that in the course of October alone, the Fourth Army had to return 2,100 guns as useless, either shot to bits, buried, or completely destroyed. 2. West Flanders, November 11th, 1917. I made use of the time during which the division was moving from the quiet park of Varsenere into the battle zone to attend a conference of Instruction in Duties to the Fatherland officers, which happened to be held in Ghent. I knew that in this phase of the war, when the iron-tired motor lorries, wagons and horses can hardly move on the roads, when the trains go no faster than a walking pace, when all the tracks are jammed with transport and troops moving up and down, a division would need time to complete even this comparatively small move, so I could get away. When I arrived this evening in the neighbourhood of Rulers and looked for the division, everything in my department, both men and material, was still somewhere on the way between Bruges and its destination. Only my horses had arrived. The evening was unusually quiet, the enemy either exhausted or else short of ammunition, and the muddy roads were only occasionally lit up by the flash of gunfire. I felt my way as best I could in the darkness, past ghostly transport lines, to a strange house and a strange bed, where I spent the last hours of the night under my cloak in my boots and trousers. I was not a little surprised when I found in the morning that everything was changed, and that I was in the well-known manse in which R.T. used to live when he was still battalion commander. In those days his battalion was quartered here alone. The hamlet was quiet, clean and peaceful. Today there are 2 divisional staffs, transport columns, bakeries, ration dumps and God knows what else all on top of one another and jealous of one another's space. In the marketplace there stands, like a herd of elephants rounded up, mass of lorries, splashed and plastered with mud up to the springs, and sagging askew almost down to their axles. The movement of carts, horses, tramways, motorcars, motorcycles and boots, all stamping, clattering, hooting, snorting and pushing along the same street, deafens one's senses like a blast from hell. Arras and the Somme were nothing to this. All the same, one still has the impression that some sort of invisible order is being preserved in the whole mess. Not, of course, as if everything were being done with the least possible expenditure of effort, but rather as if the engine were running its poor best with its furnace stoked to the utmost on its last bit of coal. Our agents say that the English are preparing another superhuman effort, but however much ammunition and artillery the enemy employs, he cannot achieve more than simply make our first zone of defence untenable. He cannot advance more than 500 yards in one thrust unless something goes quite wrong with us, and for the next thrust he needs more time. West Flanders, November 14th, 1917. It is appalling up at the front. I have just come back from a visit to our best regiment, which is holding a position I know well to the north of Passchendaele, and has had heavy losses in the very first days. It is right in the mud, without any protection, without a single decent dugout, for in this rapid withdrawal there is no time to dig. How many of those fellows who a fortnight ago were cheerfully celebrating the glorious record of their regiment will never laugh again? Even the others who can laugh again do not laugh for long. My fellows are in tears, reports one battalion commander in despair, whose whole battalion lay covered by a regular blanket of English shells. Many of the men can hardly speak. You see wild eyes gazing out of faces which are no longer human. They have a craving after brandy, which can hardly be satisfied, and which shows how badly they yearn to lose the faculty for feeling. Men drink it who have never touched it before, as though by instinct. Although nothing very much in the way of bombardment was being vouchsafed us, I found myself practically the only one going towards the front. I saw nothing but men coming back. Only field kitchens and stretcher-bearers, that is to say, people whose nerves are fed from the rear, were making their way forwards. Scores of men were streaming to the rear, one by one, but without stopping, all in need of rest. Not malingerers, no doubt merely men who need 1 day or 2 to come to themselves again. It is a perfectly honourable demand to make, but while the company commanders are forced to send first one and then another, and then a third to the rear because they are no use in the line, the battalion commander or the regimental commander is always calling out for more men to defend a position which is in danger, or to meet an expected attack. One sees much magnificent conduct calmly and coolly shown in the middle of much which is less admirable and weaker. That type of man makes allowances for the others by increasing his own efforts. A battalion commander, Freiherr von G., stuck to his battalion for 2 days with a splinter of shell in his lung. He remained simply as an example. He knew it, and such examples have an effect. One cannot say that the moral is low or weak. The regiments simply show a sort of staggering and faltering, as people do who have made unheard-of efforts. I simply cannot describe the appearance of this country, which in 1915 and 1916 flourished in spite of the war, because there was so much sap and vigour left in it. The town of rulers in particular gives you an impression of unutterable sadness. The greater part of the inhabitants fled during a bombardment, which did not, as a matter of fact, do much damage. Wherever they left the houses were plundered. Wherever the windows and shutters were not shattered by the bursting of the great shells, they were senselessly smashed in by the soldiers, and many, many rooms which might later have served as billets were ruined for this purpose. Generally speaking, there was nothing of any use or value left in the locked-up shops, but the men had to steal and smash and plunder and defile. It does not occur to any of them that next week his comrades will have no shelter. Today, any of them will smash up a house in search of a half bottle of brandy, which he is already more or less convinced that he won't find. So it is in everything. A man breaks down a whole barn to get a bundle of straw, a whole house to get a load of wood, ruins a wine cellar for the sake of a bottle of wine, and a chateau for the sake of 1 night's sleep. West Flanders, November 16th, 1917. Russia in these days presents a spectacle which repeats itself again and again. A mob is always arrogant. It seizes power without the slightest consideration, but also without the slightest capacity to exercise it. Again and again on these occasions it lays claim to this capacity, but in nearly every case it fails. They always want to behave at once in the grand manner, just in the old style. An inaugural banquet of these new rulers in the city banqueting hall must be a priceless sight. Twopenny halfpenny lawyers, barristers and swindlers of all descriptions are the leaders, and ignorance, conceit and megalomania sit at table together. I have always found these episodes of history as significant as the story of Circe transforming men into swine. It is a wonderful symbol of what human beings can come to. Once upon a time I had an idea of writing a play on this theme. I imagined a scene in which the swine were sitting at table together in Circe's palace. Why on earth do these thoughts come back to me? Same date, I do not wish to forget a wonderful letter which I have just received. The man who wrote it is chaplain to one of our hospitals. He was looking for the regiment of his only son who had been killed a few days ago on this front. His grave is already behind the English lines. The father writes, "How, out of pride in this son of his, he is going to preach in his parish at home on this great experience. I should like to hear that sermon, although sermons are not things which I usually run after. I found this man just after he had received news of his son's death. He wanted to reach his regiment, the spot where he had fallen, and needed a few days' leave. That was what brought him to me. As he spoke to me about his boy, his face lit up under his tears. To have experienced this grief seemed to him a marvellous achievement. He was proud to have been so rich that so much could be taken from him. November 1917. The English have not attacked again for the last few days. Today our regiments are being withdrawn for 6 days from their so-called positions. Then I suppose they will spend a few more relieving others in the thick of it. But I have a feeling that Tommy over yonder has lost some of his keenness. According to prisoners, our new howitzers are doing their duty. November 22nd, 1917. We are right off the track. Everywhere there is illusion, which amounts to the same thing. When once a war is begun, both sides always feel equally justified. For when once the two opponents have entered the battle, they have got to go on with it. Neither of them can say, "I am not going to fight, you go on with the war by yourself." So they both go on fighting for their rights, each under the illusion, but also with the firm conviction that their rights are better than the others. Every individual suffers from the same illusion, and is bound to suffer from it if he is to be of any use in the struggle. But even those few who have the courage to look again, and who wipe their eyes in order to drive away the fog and dispel the illusion, even they have got off the track like the rest. Even those with eyes to see become blind when they too are swept along to their fate. Instead of trusting their own feelings, they share the feelings of their comrades, and speak of right as they do, of Kultur as they do, of freedom as they do, and of honour as they do. What nonsense it is! I would rather be punished than fight for what people round about me call Kultur, but one is far from possessing one's own will. One does not seem true to oneself, nor is one. Instead of fighting for oneself as one battling for his rights, one fights for others and for the rights of a generality, of the existence of which one can only be convinced so long as one does not reflect. How satisfactory was the medieval notion that the victor justified his innocence, his rights, his claim to his throne, his wife, or his kingdom, simply through his victory. In those days it would never have occurred to anyone in the course of a battle or a campaign to try and convince the world that he was in the right. That was proved only by the victory. Those men were more honourable than we. Even though a duel proves nothing according to modern ideas of right, the duellist who has any sense of his own worth will still say to himself, "The other man has his rights too. Which of us has the better rights nobody can tell." If we could feel like that on both sides, we should be a long way nearer to peace and the right track. Then one would have enough of this sort of fighting, which brings no decision. Flourishing nations have been so exhausted by war in the past that their prosperity has ceased forever, and their sap dried up. The notion that your enemy has his rights, and that no one knows whether his are better than yours, would of course not do away with war, but it would make it only possible in campaigns of short duration, in which third parties could not and would not wish to take part, for they too would argue in the same way. Thus great devastation would be avoided. If the stronger gains the victory, that is one of nature's laws, which gives the advantage to the stronger, it is true, but which the world has tolerated long enough without cutting itself to pieces, and to the general satisfaction of men. The notion that the other man has his rights, and that no one knows which are the better, is a manly one. The other notion, that I only have rights, or that one nation alone has rights, is childish. Naturally, this point of view will be dubbed unpatriotic, but it is perfectly natural that any point of view higher than that which is held by the rest of the world today should be unpatriotic. Same date. Whether one sits up to the waist in a slimy shell hole, or in a wooden hut, or in a worn-out village billet with oleographs and little painted plaster of Paris figures of the Virgin on the wall, it's all the same. One gets used up. As it is the same with everybody, the company which one affords to anybody else becomes just as bad as that which one obtains oneself from him. Lethargy wins hands down. The field library is quite good. There is the theatre in Bruges. But the desire to see Lucy Hofflich as Gretchen is, in the present circumstances, absurd, and the impression produced by good books is very much reduced by the further impression that they are something entirely alien to you. I often imagine to myself how Frederick the Great must have felt after 7 years of war. He always says himself how much the last years affected him. Even men like General von Lossberg, who is made of iron if ever a man was, show how rapidly exhaustion comes. He looks grey and old, and yet only last month I saw him full of vigour. And then again there comes the quite extraordinary counter-sensation that one would not wish to lose any of these years out of one's life, that one would not wish to have spent this time, or even part of this time, on a happy island, that one hopes to win something by the very length of one's endurance, that one is prepared to suffer even worse, even more revolting things. All this out of obstinacy, out of a lust for things which lead one to extremes. It seems as if in all this there lay something positive, some gain, some worth, some change for the better. November 25th, 1917. Just at my corner, the road comes up to the level of the window. The noise of the tramway, of the transport, the lorries, the horses' hooves, the nailed boots, the shouting and pushing and snorting, makes sleep quite impossible. Between midnight and 3 a.m. it gets a bit quieter, but about 3 o'clock the din begins again in the other direction. No sooner is the tramway by, with its shrill clatter and clang, than one's awakened senses begin to listen for the motor transport column. 26 times in succession, the house shakes to equal waves of vibration. Then come the wagons. The tramway carries ammunition, the lorries carry ammunition, the wagons carry ammunition. This idea, night after night, has something unspeakably distressful about it, which prevents one sleeping, for even when the din is by the idea remains. 2. Lichtervelde, December 16th, 1917. The division is once again out at rest for the time being, but already mighty preparations are being made for the spring. Everybody understands that spring means offensive, and everything derives fresh activity from this thought. Our quarters are the worst, dirtiest, and most poverty-stricken that we have ever had. I am sitting in my Galician sheepskin in front of a bare board, which is my work table. The so-called bed is a smelly up and down of seaweed, which can be located by a sheet of paper which represents the bedside mat. An acetylene lamp emits a gentle odour of garlic, which joins successfully in the competition of the other smells. The washing water is black with the coal dust spread all over the room by the little stove, which claims the right of not heating in return for this blessing. The heavy guns thunder backwards and forwards from the front. The lorries and transport rattle and drone, just as they did in the last village. Only the tramway is missing. 2. December 25th, 1917. I was so tired and seedy when I wrote you my last 2 letters that I was almost afraid that you must have noticed it. It seemed as if none of the love which I wanted to express would come, almost as if it could not be really true. I was terribly worn out with fever and noise. Today I am better. I must have been fairly run down physically. At any rate, I ate yesterday evening like a beggar, and all the wines which had been collected and served up for Christmas Eve tasted good, although I knew perfectly well how second-rate they were. My body sucked them up with a sort of voracity over which I had no control. It gets hold of you like that in sickness and does you good. Finally, I fell into a deep sleep, and woke up today in a condition which I welcome as sound. So it's to be in the spring, you write about the war. Is that already the feeling in the country, or is it only your own? Here one has only one thought in the spring, and everyone feels convinced. Everyone feels that a damnable thorn has been removed from the flesh since Russia has opened peace negotiations. New Year's Eve, 1917. So today we speed the parting year and welcome a new one tomorrow. The world is crying out just as busily for peace as it is arming itself to carry on the war. Both sides are no doubt quite genuine with their outcry. We should find it most extraordinary of all to accept ourselves, since we are longing not only for peace, but also for the great victory in the West. Yes, no peace in the East at any price without victory in the West. There is nobody with sound senses who does not catch himself thinking that. If our military situation were worse, we should think otherwise. But people talk now of Calais, Amiens and Paris, as they did in the first months of the war, and at the same time they speak of peace as of a fact which will happen as surely as the beginning of spring or the solstice. New Year's wishes, New Year's hopes, they have an almost amiable appearance, but I don't believe in any of it. We shall never have peace with England and America, so long as they do not need to make it, and they do not need to yet. January 12, 1918. The Supreme Army Command has asked the officers in charge of instruction in duties to the fatherland for a report on the effect of the Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations on the morale of the troops. Exhaustive investigations for this purpose were made by myself and my subordinates. I set down the report compiled from my own observations and from the investigations among the rank and file just as it was sent in to 4th Army Headquarters. The Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations have beyond question had an inspiriting effect on the troops. The very fact that peace negotiations are in progress fills them with hope and expectation. These hopes are exclusively set on the conclusion of peace with Russia first, and with the Western powers possibly or probably after a successful offensive. They are so set upon peace that a breakdown of the negotiations in the East would produce a very appreciable depression. The conditions for peace in the East, as set forth and propounded by our delegates, appear to the men more practical and comprehensible than the general formula of no annexation, no indemnities, and self-determination. No misgivings are felt about the conditions of peace. Units which are some distance from the front line seem inclined to favour bigger claims than their comrades who are in touch with the enemy. The attitude of the men towards our delegates in the negotiations with Russia is one of great confidence and patient expectation. They are satisfied that the Supreme Army Command, which represents the only certain backing on which the rank and file can rely in all things, has made sure of exercising a sufficient influence on the peace conditions. All formations, particularly those largely composed of elder men, are opposed to any German demands which are likely to impede or delay the conclusion of peace. With few exceptions, the men do not take up a very critical attitude towards the negotiations. As reported above, they have general confidence in the Supreme Army Command. In many cases, active officers and NCOs consider that the formula of no annexation, no indemnities is unsatisfactory and inadequate in view of the dearly bought successes which they consider have been obtained. In spite of this, it is fully realized that no annexation in the East is necessary or advisable, and that the peace ought properly to bear the aspect which is proposed. As for a definite peace in the West, an offensive is not only expected, but considered necessary as the best means of achieving it. Everybody is convinced both of its imminence and of its success. Now that their backs are covered, the reliance and confidence of the troops in this respect is unbounded. In no cases, however, do they regard it as a means of obtaining a favourable peace, but simply as a way to bring matters to a conclusion. January 13th, 1918. Army Headquarters have just telephoned to me that they are forwarding my report in the original to the Supreme Army Command. West Flanders, January 13th, 1918. Our little Excellency the General is certainly one of the bravest in face of the enemy. Nothing can disturb his calm, which makes this hero's nervousness of other things all the more amusing. Just at present he is on leave in Munich. His distaste for this town is enough to make you laugh. It contains theatres, famous buildings, artists, monuments, palaces, pictures and galleries, all of which call for some appreciation, whereas they mean practically nothing to him. He wriggled like an eel to get out of going there. It is clear that he regards associations of this sort as an effort for him, and he considers them particularly from a distance as a greater hardship to endure than weeks of war on the Flanders front. He went off with very mixed feelings and secret regrets for his afternoon game of patience, his evening of cards, and his usual army rations, which he likes simple, all of which he will have to give up in the Hotel Leinfelder at Munich. That is what I like about this man. February 12th, 1918. I reckon that for the future the war will simply go to pieces, hastened possibly by some tremendous cataclysm. All the same, I have a much better feeling and hopes about our new venture than I had about our undertaking at Verdun. Everything which is being done now is on a sound basis. I must not say more, nor yet less, than that. There is any amount to do, very absorbing things. Naturally, it is impossible so far for any of us to know whether, or to what extent, we are taking part in any particular operation, and even when we know we may not say. Everything which one hears from other quarters is mere rumour. The peace with Russia no longer excites any enthusiasm, even now that it is an accomplished fact. Not a single bottle of wine was drunk to celebrate it. All the same, the fact that everything which Russia represented is no longer at war with us is the most important event which has happened to us since the outbreak of war. But we have got no joy peals left in us. People seem to have left them behind with some other part of their being. And then, now come the Americans. March 4th, 1918. So my father is really off to the headquarters of the 11th Army in Macedonia to deliver lectures. To boast 77 years of age and to carry them so debonairly is a fine thing. Kortrijk, March 7th, 1918. Busy with preparations. Field post suspended. The division moving. Before the offensive, March 20th, 1918. I hardly know how to write. I have had to keep silence so long, but tomorrow, they say, the field post will start again. Tomorrow there will be nothing to keep secret, for then hell breaks loose. Before the letters go to the rear, which will be in a few hours, I want just to come to you in these lines. Of course, I know that I cannot entirely escape the day which is so relentlessly approaching. It is a tremendous thing for every one of us. Aeschylus says that a drama ought to excite hope and fear, but here is one already showing behind the curtain and awakening both of these sensations before it even rises. It will be a drama like a Greek tragedy, with a fate hanging over it, shaped and created by man alone, and ready to descend on the head of him who is responsible. The preparations are quite inconceivable in detail, and can only be described as the last word. The troops are packed in position so tight that those in front have been there for the last 10 days. For weeks past, ammunition has been hauled and hauled, night after night, to be piled in mountains round the guns. All that is to be poured out on the enemy in 4 hours from now. One division lies behind another to an incalculable depth, and 3 armies, the 18th, the 2nd, and the 17th, are to attack together in unison on an infinitesimal front. So far as possible, the troops will advance over ground which they know from the Somme battles. Our own objective is the area where we lay in January and February of last year. The attack will be delivered over the territory which we laid waste, and where there are neither roads, trees, nor villages. We belong to the second wave. It is impossible as yet to say whether this will have the easier task or the first. Since March 1st, the horses have been getting a ration of £10 of oats, and all the attacking divisions have been provided with first-class remounts from the Quartermaster General's reserve. God knows how Ludendorff has got them together. I am still 200 short for the division, but they are to be given me when we advance, or during the battle. Naturally, the railways have been working day and night at this business, waiting for thousands of trains with men, horses, guns, wagons, ammunition, tools, rations, bridging material, and 100 other things was a trying business for everybody. We are all going as light as possible. All unnecessary baggage has been ruthlessly prohibited. We all left it willingly behind, buoyed up by a final hope. The organisation is really great, but it was, of course, impossible to keep the secret. In Brussels, every child knows that the offensive is to begin on March 21st. Villers-Outreaux, March 21st, 1918. I have just come across the first English prisoners, companies of English and Irish regiments of different divisions. They are all magnificently equipped with leather jerkins, good puttees, and excellent boots. An awfully good-looking young English captain is just waiting, with a smiling, interested face, for me to speak to him. So I do. It appears they had been expecting the attack for the past 20 days, but did not expect it today. The preliminary bombardment by our guns seemed to him much too mild for that. Although the English reserves were very close up, they could not be used owing to the fog and the quickness of our infantry. This officer wore the most wonderful riding boots. When I looked him up and down, he apologized for not being properly dressed for marching. He said he had just been going for a ride. He appeared to take it rather amiss that our attack had not left him time to dress himself in proper style, with boots and puttees to be taken prisoner. March 22nd, 1918. Here I am in the middle of generals, horses, orderlies, dead and wounded. Yesterday's attack would have completely succeeded had not the gas cloud from our own guns lain too long on the ground. The infantry could not get forward through this poison barrier.